So I tell you this renewable energy integration from resource assessment to power system impacts, and I just want to show, one, some of the data that we make publicly available that can be utilized in some of the IRP studies and other sort of long-term planning studies. And then secondly, I want to just focus on one of the studies that we did looking at one of the ways that you can put more flexibility into the system or better integrate renewable energy. So for those of you that don't know much about the national labs, there's 17 spread out throughout the country. And if you'll notice one thing about them, there's only one marked here in green. That's probably not a, that was probably a conscious choice on the map maker side, because that's us right here in Golden, Colorado, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and we're the only one that is sponsored primarily by the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Most of the others are nuclear labs or Office of Science labs as well. This is just one picture of our main campus down at South Table Mountain, about 20 miles south here. We also do have another campus about 5 miles south of Boulder that you may have seen. If you're driving down 93, you'll see the utility scale wind turbines. So that's where we do a lot of our testing on actual utility scale generation as well. So short drive for me here today to talk about some renewable energy integration concepts. I think one of the great things that Patrick brought up was that we are making this transition, and it's happening for a number of different reasons. We're moving from a mostly inertial-based, fossil generation-based system to one that has quite a bit more asynchronous generation, quite a bit more variable and uncertain generation as well. And for that reason, when we're making these long-term decisions, these are very expensive, and they have long time consequences, right? You build a new plant that lasts for 30 years or more. We're talking billions of dollars in investment here, probably trillions. And so it's really important that we do this right in order to do it in the most economically efficient manner, but then also maintain system reliability. And the key thing, in my view, for that is accurate modeling of the future system. In order to do that, we need both good models, but then we also need good data. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the data that's available to utilize in those studies. Now, why are we actually worried about this? Well, I think everybody knows this, but wind and solar power are variable and uncertain, right? This is wind over the course of about 10 days. You go from more or less full generation all the way down to zero generation fairly quickly, right, over the course of hours. This is from a plant here in northern Colorado, actually. Solar generation, you can see, is very variable depending on the time scale. And so that's an important point that we need to consider as well. The variability and uncertainty here is different at different time scales and different geographic scales as well. So if you're looking at 1-minute data, and this is GHI, so global horizontal irradiance, not power output, but you have quite a bit of variability. You have cloud cover that comes through, you have your PV going up and down. Now, you go to the 1-hour level, and it starts to be a lot more smooth, right? And this is one of the key drivers why we're seeing a lot of people moving from, say, hourly modeling to sub-hourly modeling, because it's important to be able to capture this sort of variability within the system. Okay, so one of the consequences of this is you're starting to see things like the famous, maybe infamous, duck curve in California, where you have solar generation suppressing sort of the demand during the day, and then you have sharper increased ramps, both in the evenings, and then from wind power, which is predominantly sort of more prevalent at night, and then dies down a little bit in the morning in many regions on land, you have increased morning ramps as well. And so we need more flexibility in the system in order to handle this. And there's a number of different ways that we can get flexibility. We've talked about some of them. The large-scale movement toward natural gas units is one source of flexibility, right? Generally speaking, natural gas units are more flexible than coal plants. But there are many other things we can do as well. There's storage, we'll see a talk later about electric vehicles, a lot of different options. And this just details some of those. Now, I don't want to go into all these, but there's two things, at least, in my opinion, to consider when talking about different flexibility options. One is the cost, but then there's also sort of the institutional difficulty of doing things as well, right? And so we've seen a lot of these transitions on some of the ones that have low institutional difficulty. So, for example, moving from hourly to sub-hourly scheduling and dispatch. You have So different ways you can change your system operation, that's one, and we're going to focus on another one, the low-hanging fruits here, renewable energy forecasting here in a second. But then you have all sorts of other things. You can have your renewable energy provide services, right? Excel here in Colorado has wind plants on AGC. Did anybody know that? That's pretty incredible, right? And that's something that they've been doing for over 5 years now. So there's options there as well. We have projects where we are looking at distributed PV actually providing voltage support on the distribution system. So this is another way that these generators don't have to just cause challenges for the system. They have to be part of the solution once they get to over a very small percentage. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, you can also do demand response. You can operate your plants differently. You can build more transmission. You can add storage. All these are options. I just want to focus here on one of the low-hanging fruits, renewable energy forecasting. But first, I want to talk about resource data sets. Because if we're going to make these very large-scale, long-term decisions, the classic rule of modeling still applies, right? Garbage in equals garbage out. And so if you have very bad data, then your results aren't going to be believable. It's going to be very hard to make decisions for 30 years based on that. And so I want to talk to you about one resource data set that we make publicly available at NREL. It's called the Wind Toolkit. So it provides meteorological data and estimated wind power data for over 125,000 sites throughout the United States. It does this at 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer spatial resolution and 5-minute temporal resolution. We also, on top of that, have the associated meteorological variables, so things like temperatures that are important, things like humidity, also important for helping estimate load. And this is so that we can have consistent data sets. These same meteorological phenomena drive load, wind, and solar. And so when we're doing this modeling, we need to make sure that we have time-synchronous data from all three of those in order to accurately portray the effects that they're going to have on the system. Along with this, we also have forecast data for that. So we've simulated the day-ahead and hour-ahead forecasting process so that you can utilize that in your unit commitment economic dispatch models or your capacity expansion models. We have this for 7 years of data, 2007 to 2013, to use as your base years. And this is all freely and publicly available. You can go download it right now on our website. Okay, so a little bit more information about this. How do we actually create this? Well, we use a numerical weather prediction model. What that does, in this case, is the WRF model, actually, and it simulates the physics of the atmosphere. So it takes a number of different grids or domains over North America, and then goes down into smaller scales. So it uses reanalysis data provided by NASA or NOAA, and then downscales that using essentially the Navier-Stokes equations. So what it does is there's a lot of different options you can use, how you do boundary schemes, how you do surface roughness, things like that. But we've gone through a lot of testing and tried to get this as accurately as possible in order to produce consistent data sets so that you know if you have 2 wind plants, you're going to have realistic correlation between them. Sometimes, let's just say you have one in the west, one in the east. If you have a front moving through from west to east, you can expect a decrease here or an increase here, and then an hour later on the other plant. It's important to capture those correlations so that we're not assuming they're completely dependent or completely independent, because those can lead to either overly conservative solutions, which cost money, or underly conservative solutions, which affect reliability, right? And so understanding those correlations and having a consistent model is very important. We did a down selection procedure on this because, well, that's millions of points at 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers over the entire United States, but we have the meteorological data that underlies that. We did the power conversion for 125,000 sites. As you would expect, a lot of these are in the areas that have the best wind potential, right? But we wanted to make sure to get some geographic diversity as well. So for locations, say, in the southeast that don't have as high capacity factors, let's say, we made sure to include at least 1 wind plant in every county in the United States. And so there is some data even for areas that haven't seen the historical development that others have. Okay, we did quite a bit of validation on this. I just want to talk a little bit about one thing, and that's just a wind speed validation. So these are histograms of your wind speeds at these locations One is Cape May, so this is a pretty easy location. Just offshore, flat geography, not that difficult. And you can see that the modeled wind speeds match the observed wind speeds fairly well. Okay, so that's for an easy location. Now let's take a really hard location. So this is a National Wind Technology Center, that site about 5 miles south here that I was talking about. So it's at the mouth of El Dorado Canyon. We put it there not because there's a good wind resource, but because there's actually a very difficult wind resource. This is a testing site. They get a lot of very high wind speeds that cause shutoff. So in a place with very complex geography, I mean, you guys have seen the mountains by now, we can still get fairly good performance in terms of matching the models to the observations for this location. You do get a slight over-prediction on the wind speeds in sort of this middle range, but overall, this is, can give you confidence that you are putting the right profiles into your modeling tools. We did the conversion, not only wind speed, but then also translated that to power. To do so, we took 4 different standard sort of composite turbine curves. So some of these represent some of the older technologies or technologies you might use in low wind speed areas, and then some of them also represent sort of the IEC class 3 ones that you might utilize in higher wind speed areas. And this makes a difference, right? Because of the cubic nature of the curve, you can have up to 40–50% difference for the same wind speed, depending on your type of turbine. So, very important factor when looking at this. Now, we want to make sure that this was accurate in terms of realistic behavior, not only for the wind speeds, but also for wind power. And so here we've taken a number of those sites and aggregated them into one 300 megawatt plant. And this is sort of your theoretical power curve that you would get from that plant. But anybody who's actually looked at this data for a real site knows that you don't stick to the theoretical power curve, right? You have a bunch of scatter along it. And we actually see that from our simulated data as well. So you can see a couple of things here, like you have wind turbines cutting out, but only a couple of them at a time, because you do have the difference between the edge of a storm and the rest of the wind plant. And then you have things as well as such as high-speed hysteresis cut in again. So when you cut out about, let's say, 20 meters per second, but then you have to drop down to, let's say, 16 meters per second before you cut back in. And so we capture that explicitly as well. Like I mentioned, you can open up your laptop right now, type in Wind Toolkit, and download this data for any region that you'd like at the moment. So we're really happy to make this publicly available to everyone. Okay, enough about data, and let's talk about how it actually impacts the power system. So we wanted to do a study in which we looked at the value of solar power forecasting improvements. So by now, most folks have wind power forecasting. A lot of folks are getting solar power forecasting into the system as well. Can we improve it? And if we do, what's the economics behind that? How much money can we actually save? So we did a study of the ISO New England system in which we looked at a large number of different future solar penetration rates. So we kept adding out solar power into the ISO New England system, and then wanted to see how, as we improve the forecast, how that impacts the system-wide costs. Now, it's important to note here that we're not, so ISO New England is a market, we're not trying to assign those costs to individual generators or to the IOUs. We're looking at this purely from the system perspective. So how those costs get sort of passed on is a completely different and more regulatory question. But what we wanted to focus on was these are the savings that hopefully eventually go to the consumer. Okay, so a bit about ISO New England if you don't know much about it. So we did a study here down to the 69 kV level, which is fairly high detail for such a large system. We used the base year of 2006 for the weather year for this, and then we projected load growth, and then we projected generation out as well. So there the max was almost 30 gigawatts at the peak load time, and then 132 terawatt hours of total generation. So ISO New England is highly interconnected. You can't just isolate the system and then expect to get the right results, right? And so we do explicitly model the interconnections with New Brunswick, Hydro-Quebec, which is very important, and then New York ISO as well. We do this with a $3 a megawatt hour wheeling cost. And the reason why we do this is because we're running mathematical programming models, right? Optimization. These will chase every last dime. You wouldn't actually trade for a cent difference, right? You would use your own generation in that case. And so this just represents a little bit of the friction in the system that you actually see. Okay, so let's look at the generation mix quickly. So ISO New England has a bit of nuclear, a bit of coal, and lots of gas. Very gas-dominated system. And then you have oil here as well. That's mainly used for peaking purposes. Tiny bit of hydro, tiny bit of pumped hydro, and then we've added in the largest case, this solar power, using a data set very similar to the wind toolkit that I just showed you. Okay, so great, you have a model, but is it worth anything? Well, on a yearly basis, you can see that the generation from the system matches up pretty well. So this is without solar power. We have, here's your gas. It makes up about the same percentage in the published data as the model results. Yearly data is very easy, right? Let's look at something a little finer scale. And these are hourly LMPs from ISO New England. So this is, the red here is the model results, and the black is the ISO New England published data. So you can see these actually match very well. This is about 80% of the time, and then this is about 20% of the time. So we see some areas where we don't get as good of correlation between the two. And the reason for that is very simple: outages. We didn't include specific unit outage data that can have a very large effect, especially on peak prices. So I was actually pretty amazed by this in that you don't see production cost models actually being able to match historical prices this well. Just another way of looking at that is the price duration curve. So you can see that the ISO New England published data is slightly higher price here for the sort of highest price hours of the year. And again, that's an outage function, right? By not explicitly knowing exactly when all the outages were, you can't represent that bump up the dispatch stack that you have to take. Okay, so to cut to the chase, you add in solar power. What happens? Your gas generation actually goes down at first. Your coal generation goes down eventually as well. But what you see here is you actually increase some of your oil and gas turbine units, not your steam units. Why is that? You need more flexibility in the system. And so you have to start these up more often. You have to ramp them more often, and so you get more generation out of those technologies. You also, if you improve the forecast, hopefully this isn't a surprise to anybody, but you save money. So, and the amount of money you save increases as you have higher penetrations. So at the 18% level, and if you had, say, perfect forecast, that's the 100% case, this amounts to about $30 million a year on the ISO New England level. To put that in a different perspective, you can see these dollars per megawatt hour. That's megawatt hours of solar. So for the 4.5% case, if you improve your forecast by 25%, you're saving 11 cents for every megawatt hour of solar you produce. If you go to, let's just say, the 9% case and a 75% improvement, that increases to about 75 cents per megawatt hour. Okay, now who actually does this and who bears the cost, who receives the benefits? That's all an interconnection question, in my opinion. But it does highlight the need to start pushing that into your PPAs if you're going to buy wind or solar power in large amounts. Okay, but what's happening in the system that drives these cost savings? I think it's important to look at both an under-forecasting event and an over-forecasting event in order to demonstrate that. So this is your day-ahead unit commitment, and then this is what actually happens in real time. So at the 0% forecasting, so these are the state-of-the-art forecasts, you think, I'm not going to have much solar power today. What happens in the real time is you actually get a lot of solar power, so your forecast was off. Because of that, you have to curtail, and then you have much higher ramping on all of your units. So as you improve the forecast by 25%, now you think there's going to be a bit of solar, you still get the same amount, you reduce the amount of curtailment, you reduce the amount of ramping that you have on the other units. This is most striking, of course, in the 50% case. Now, in the opposite case, where you have over-forecasting, you think there's going to be a lot of solar in the day ahead, and not as much shows up. So what happens? Well, you turn on your most expensive units, because those are the ones that can react quickly enough. So by improving the forecast, you reduce the amount of oil and gas GTs, which are obviously your most expensive units. All of your costs come down, and this is where you see the cost savings from the improved solar power forecast. To wrap up, renewable energy integration is obviously a very important topic, and good modeling is a key in order to understand the implications. We need to understand the basic meteorology, though, of the wind and solar resources before we can really look at that, because we need to be able to put the best data into our models to get the best results out. Solar power is changing the way we operate the system, and forecasting is one of the ways that we can reduce the uncertainty involved in wind and solar power forecasting. It's really one of the low-hanging fruits here. Easy to implement, relatively cheap as well. So I'd like to thank the large number of people, both at NREL and other locations, who have worked on these things that I talked about today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
You said that the input data is from the WRF model,
Yeah.
which is a downscaling model.
Yep.
You said you got the data from the National Weather Service, NASA.
Yeah, NASA MERA is the reanalysis data set. So that's at a roughly 40 kilometer by 40 kilometer resolution. So that's historical data that they do for the entire globe. And so we take that from 40 kilometer to 40 kilometer, and then we use the WRF model to downscale it down to 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer by simulating the physics of the atmosphere.
So it's all history?
Yes, so this is all historical data. And how you use this is, in your IRP, you don't actually use a 2020 load, right, because you don't have it. You take 2010 load and you scale it up to 2020. And so the important thing is getting the meteorological data that you use for your load to be the same as your wind and solar, because on those days that you have lots of AC load because it's hot out, those are the days you're going to have lots of solar power too, and probably not that much wind. And so it's important to keep those correlations intact.
Okay, so this is all, you're backcasting.
Essentially.
None
Yep.
of this is forecasting.
So all the resource data is essentially, it's resource assessment. It's backcasting on that data to give you the historical data set on which you can then look at the future situations.
Doesn't that does that bias your study? Because when you get into the real world and you're using forecast data that's not worth a damn, how does that work?
So the backcast data is what we use for the actuals. So that's how much power you actually produce. What we did was we ran the same model with different parameters and different resolution for a day-ahead forecast as well. So we have not only the actual data set that you use here, but also your forecast data set. So to put it in the IRP context, or think about it in terms of load, when you're doing your load studies, let's say you use your load from 2010 and then you grow that to 2020, right? You're also going to use your load forecasting models in order to produce forecasts for that time period too. So we're just doing the exact same thing as you would in an IRP.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to get my hands around the forecasted data. So, but the WRF model, it's downscaling.
Yes.
And the original source is probably, say, from the GFS model, the 300.
You could use GFS. Yeah, we use MERA, but yeah.
So how far does that go up? How many hours?
So GFS generally goes to 72 hours ahead, I believe.
And are they comparable? Is the NASA and that data set comparable?
Yeah, so the MERA, GFS, there's a couple others as well that are very similar.
Okay, so I understand what you're doing on the backcast.
Yeah.
But I just think it's somewhat misleading when you get into the forecasting end, because that data is suspect at best.
Well, no, think about it this way. If you had to forecast for tomorrow, right now, what would you use? You would use the weather conditions that you have right now,
right,
and then you would use something like WRF in order to forecast it, right? So we're doing that exact same thing. We're taking the data that we have, for the future time frame, the actual data, and from the day beforehand, we're running the WRF model again in order, using different parameters, using less information in order to do the forecast going forward.
And so you only need to go out about a day or 2 days?
Yeah, we generally go 48 hours ahead. Yeah.
I'm not so much sure on the wind, but the temperatures, they're not, they're just off. I mean,
Well,
it's an accurate forecast with respect, is it gonna be blowing like crazy, or is it not gonna be blowing at all? But is it 1, 2, or 3 mile per hour, or 4? I mean, all of a sudden now, what's the reference point on the accuracy?
Yeah, there's forecast errors in this, just like you see in the real system. So we actually did a huge comparison compared to existing wind plants and the forecast errors that you see from them. And the error distributions and the MEE's RMSE values look very, very similar to the state of the art when we did this, which was 2014.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry, I think there's one more, but we probably, I'll try to be really quick, sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah, just so I understand the cost savings.
Sure.
So if you're forecasting better, then you're able to use the right resources.
Yep.
And if you're caught by surprise, you have to fire up your most flexible generators, which also happen to be least efficient. Is that
Usually.
right?
Yep.
So those like recips or?
Generally, in the ISO New England case, that's what most of them are. Or gas turbines instead of combined cycles, things like that.
Yeah, but if your more flexible units are also more efficient, then you wouldn't realize cost savings.
If your more flexible units are cheaper, you would have them in the original plan, right? And then they may not be available in order to provide that flexibility. So that's one of the key concerns they need to focus on, is whether you have the flexibility that's required in the day ahead, or in real time.
I think you raised a good point. If you have a unit that is able to react within 5 minutes, typically no startup costs, there's very little value in the better forecast.
Right, because you've got the flexibility.
If that unit isn't already producing, right? I agree, if that unit's not already producing. But if that unit is that cheap, then it's already going to be in the dispatch stack, right? Unless you hold it as a reserve, unless you're paying it to provide reserves.
Yeah, so this isn't a plug, but I'm from GE, and we have small aeroderivative gas turbines that we've now hybridized with batteries.
Yep.
So they're instantaneous,
Yep.
they're incredibly flexible, and they're also highly efficient. So it kind of depends on, you could save costs just by having more flexible units.
Oh, agreed. I mean, I agree entirely. So, the dirty little secret of flexibility is that there's, each of these different technologies sort of eats into the value of all the other ones, right? So if you have a system that's just all recips and nothing else, well, you wouldn't even do day-ahead scheduling, right? You only do day-ahead scheduling because you have units that take a day to start up and shut down. And so you wouldn't even need a lot of the other technologies.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.